If God created everything good, where did evil come from? You know, Christians usually say evil entered the world through human sin, right? Adam and Eve disobeyed God, sin entered creation, and then everything broke from there for all of us. But that doesn't solve the problem. It just moves it back one step. Because on the common Christian reading, before Adam and Eve ever sinned, Satan had already turned against God. Deception and rebellion were already present before humans ever ate from the tree. So where did that come from? If Satan was created good, why did he want to rebel in the first place? If rebellion can arise then inside a world that God called good before human sin enters the picture, then human beings are not the original explanation for the problem. They just can't be. And if God created Satan knowing exactly what he would become, then God knowingly created the conditions where deception and suffering and sin and hell and everything Christianity later says Jesus had to fix would become possible in the first place. Look, I preached this version of this story for years and believed it like it was true. I talked about the fall of Adam and Eve and sin and redemption and the salvation we all needed through Jesus. But I never just let myself really sit with all of these questions long enough and honestly enough. The standard evangelical story I believed says God created everything good. That's what it says. It also says rebellion existed before humans sinned. That's what it says. That means the problem doesn't start with Adam and Eve. It starts with the kind of world that God chose to create. Jesus makes promises about prayer that simply are not true. Let's look at what the text actually says. Matthew 7, Jesus says, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened." There are no qualifiers in those statements. They are declarative and all-inclusive. And then he says, everyone who asks receives. Again, declarative, all-encompassing. Everyone who asks receives with no qualifiers. In Matthew 18, Jesus says, if two of you agree on earth about anything that they ask, his Father in heaven will do it. Anything and will do. No qualifiers, declarative, all-inclusive. That is what the text says. But that's not how prayer actually works in the real world, and Christians know that. Pastors know that. I knew that when I was a pastor. People ask and they don't receive. People seek and they don't find. They come together in prayer where two or more are gathered with sincerity and faith and tears sometimes, praying for someone to be healed from cancer, for example. And they ask and it does not happen. So what Christians will do is they'll usually say things like, well, then the text can't mean what it plainly says. And honestly, I agree with that part. It can't mean what it plainly says because prayer doesn't work that way. But instead of admitting that Jesus made a promise that's just not true, Christians add conditions to the text. And they add things that just aren't there. They say it has to be according to God's will, or God may answer prayer in just different ways than you ask, or God's timing is not our timing. The problem is Matthew 7 says everyone who asks receives, period. And Matthew 18 does not say unless God has a different plan. It just says the Father in heaven will do it. And that's the crux of the problem. The plain reading gets rejected by Christians because Christian theology will not allow Jesus to be wrong, will not allow Scripture to be wrong, or will not allow prayer to fail. So the apologetic answer does not explain the text. It protects the doctrine over the text. And I understand why Christians do it. I did it too for more than 20 years. But if we read the passages without adding theology to them, they portray Jesus making promises about prayer that don't hold up. If there is a God and I ever stand before him, these are some of the questions that I'd have. If you wanted to forgive all of humanity, why not just forgive everyone? You're all powerful. You can literally do anything that you want to do. In the Old Testament, you forgave the city of Nineveh, a whole city without a single drop of blood. So if mercy was possible for that city back then, why does someone suddenly need to die later? And how is it even justice to punish the innocent for the crimes of the guilty? In any other context, we'd call that a human rights violation. If a judge executed a volunteer instead of a murderer, we wouldn't call that judge holy or righteous. We'd call him a monster. Why does divine justice work like that at all? If the penalty for sin is eternal hell, why isn't Jesus still in hell paying the eternal price? If death is the payment for sin, how is it really payment if Jesus immediately comes back to life? And if the resurrection was always the guaranteed outcome from the beginning, what was actually sacrificed at all? And finally, if this was your plan from the moment of creation, as the Bible says it is, what does that say about the kind of moral system that you created in the first place? I no longer believe in the Antichrist, the end times, or the idea that the Bible is predicting what's happening today. The more I studied those texts, what we call end time texts, the more obvious it became that they were just speaking to the fears and the politics and the crisis of their own time, not ours. Daniel, in the book of the Old Testament, was speaking into his turmoil of his world at his time. Revelation was speaking into the violence and the oppression of the Roman Empire. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were written in the shadow of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. None of that was written with our news cycle in mind. None of it. And this matters because end times theology doesn't just distort the Bible, it distorts people. It teaches people to live in fear. It teaches kids and teenagers to be afraid of the future. It teaches people to obsess over signs instead of dealing with today justice. It can make people passive about suffering because they've been taught that all of this is part of God's plan anyway. As a pastor, I remember thinking this, that people pouring themselves into like environmentalism, they just didn't get it. In my mind, the world was already on its way out. Jesus was coming back probably in my lifetime, and the whole thing was going to unravel anyway. But I obviously don't believe that anymore because it's not true. These texts were written by people who were scared and oppressed, and they were trying to make sense of what was happening around them. They were speaking to their own world in their own time. They were not talking about ours. So no, the Bible isn't predicting our future. Bad end times theology has kept a lot of people afraid and passive and distracted and easy to control. Letting go of that theology is one of the healthiest things that I did and any person can do. Look, if you came out of that world too, how did it affect what you actually thought mattered? I'm curious. The Bible contradicts itself. It does. And here's one of the clearest examples. In Exodus 20, God says he punishes children for the sins of their parents down to the third and fourth generation. But then in Ezekiel 18, he says exactly the opposite. The child will not suffer for the sin of the parent, and the parent will not suffer for the sin of the child. The person who sins is the one who bears the guilt. Those aren't the same claims. Those are opposite claims. God either punishes children for the sins of their parents, or he doesn't. A lot of Christians try to harmonize those verses to make them somehow work together. Look, I did this as a pastor because I was actually trained to do it in seminary. I was taught the Bible had to be without error. It had to be inerrant. It had to agree with itself. So the answer was already decided before I ever got to the text. I would bend over backwards, and I was actually taught how to bend over backwards in seminary to make the text fit the doctrine. Look, most of us were trained to read the Bible in exactly that same way. But that's not reading the Bible on its own terms. That's defending a framework we bring to the text before we ever open the book. I preached this for 20 years and I was flat out wrong. For years, I told people God answers every single prayer with a yes, a no, or a not yet. And at the time, I thought that was a really strong kind of ironclad framework as a pastor. I thought it was pastoral. I thought it helped people make sense of the silence of God. But now I think it falls apart almost immediately. So if I pray and it happens, then God said yes. If I pray and it doesn't happen, God said no. And if I pray and nothing happens for a long time, God is just saying not yet. But under that framework, what outcome would ever count as God not answering prayer? See, that's the problem. The entire structure, the whole framework is unfalsifiable. There's no outcome that would ever count against the claim. Every possible result gets absorbed back into the belief system. Do you see it? It protects the belief system and frees it from any kind of counter evidence that could be considered at all. And Christians do this with more than just prayer. I used to do it all the time. I would say if God heals someone, God gets the credit, but if he doesn't heal someone, he just had mysterious reasons. If someone feels God's presence, that proves that he's near. And if someone feels nothing from God, that just is a test of faith. Or if the Bible makes sense, God is extremely clear in his word, but if it doesn't make sense, His ways are higher than our ways. I used all of these from the pulpit as a pastor. Now, looking back, I'm genuinely shocked by how easily I accepted this whole structure. I preached it from the pulpit hundreds of times as a megachurch pastor, but once you really slow down and just critique it for honestly just a few minutes, it's not strong at all. It's extremely weak, and it falls under the weight of its own premises. It's a way of making sure that the belief never has to face counter evidence. I didn't choose to stop believing in God. This is one of the things I wish Christians really understood better. You know, people will say in the comments, "Hey Todd, you were warned," or "When you stand before God on Judgment Day, you'll know the truth," as if I'm standing here with this full belief in God and just refusing to submit to Him. That's just not the case. That's not what happened. I was a Christian for most of my life. I preached the gospel for more than 20 years. I taught people how to be saved. I prayed and studied the Word daily and defended Christianity. I built my entire life around the Word of God, and I believed I had an intimate relationship with the Christian God. And then, over time, I simply became unconvinced. That wasn't a choice in the way I choose a shirt to put on each day is a choice. I didn't wake up one morning and decide, "Hey, I think I'll stop believing in God today." I just reached a point over years of questioning where the reasons I had for believing no longer convinced me that the Christian God was real. And you know that's true, Christian, because you can't force yourself to believe things either. You can't choose to believe in Islam just because a Muslim warns you about Muslim judgment. You know, you can't choose to believe in Mormonism just because a Mormon comes to your door and tells you that you've been warned. You know, you can't choose to believe in a Greek God or a Hindu God or any other God claims just because someone threatens consequences. Belief doesn't work that way, and you inherently know that. If you're a Christian, you can choose to study, you can choose to listen, you can choose to stay open, you can choose to be honest about your beliefs, but you can't choose to believe. You can't choose to be convinced. And that's where I am. I'm not refusing God, the God that I know is real. I'm not angry at a God I secretly believe in. I'm not choosing rebellion over truth. I'm simply not convinced Christianity is true anymore. That's it. Look, and if God exists, He knows that better than anyone. Hey, Christians, help me understand this. A major part of the Christian case for Jesus depends on miracle claims that are preserved inside the Gospels, especially the resurrection. But why do Christians, why do you, treat miracle claims from other religions so differently? Take this guy, Satya Sai Baba. He was a South Indian Hindu guru with millions, not thousands, millions of followers. His devotees claimed he was divine, that his birth was miraculous, that he healed the sick and raised the dead and knew things supernaturally, and he even materialized objects out of thin air. Now, I'm not going to say that happened. I don't believe it did. But that's the point. Look, if you're a Christian watching this right now, I'm guessing you didn't feel curious when I said those things about Satya Sai Baba. You probably didn't think, man, you know what? Maybe I should do some research to see whether this guy really performed miracles in India. You probably didn't think, maybe this guy really was divine. I need to find out. You probably felt skepticism immediately, is what you probably felt. You assumed that his devotees could exaggerate, stories can grow, religious communities can interpret experiences through the beliefs they already have. Sincere people can be wrong, right? And I'm saying, yes, you already know what skepticism feels like. You just felt it regarding that guru. You felt it the second I named a miracle worker outside of your own religion. But when the miracle claims are in the Bible, most Christians start from the opposite assumption. Biblical miracle claims are true unless proven false. Miracles from another religion are false until proven true. Look, that's how I was trained. That's how I preached for over 20 years. That's how the church and Bible college and seminary usually treat these stories. We don't begin with skepticism with our Christian beliefs. We begin with faith, with belief. I don't know 1 in 100 Christians, and I'm being generous here, who's done serious historical critical research into the Bible's miracle claims outside of the Christian bubble and the sermon on Sunday and Sunday school. But I do know most Christians watching this dismissed Satya Sai Baba in about 5 seconds. And that 5-second dismissal is the whole point of this video. You already know how to be skeptical of miracle claims. You just usually don't apply that same standard to the miracles of Christianity. Tell me where I'm wrong. The Christian God says a man who is caught violating a young woman must marry her. That's the resolution. This is one of the passages that really forced me to rethink what I believed about the morality of the Christian God. And one passage that really made me wrestle with this is in Deuteronomy 22. It says very specifically, if a man meets a young woman who is not engaged, seizes her, and lies with her, and they are discovered, then he must pay money to her father and marry her. And the text says he can never divorce her. Now, the language here really matters. It says that he seizes her and he lies with her. And the text doesn't spell out every detail, but it's describing a situation where a man takes a woman sexually, and the outcome is that she becomes his wife. And notice what God's law focuses on. The payment goes to the father and not the woman, and the resolution is for this woman to be forced to marry the man who violated her. So the situation ends with the woman being permanently tied to the man who took her. Look, if something like this happened today, we wouldn't see marriage as a just outcome for the woman. We would imprison the man, and that woman would never have to see him again. We would see marrying him as compounding the harm and creating more trauma. But in this passage, God presents it as a very just and moral resolution. Now, passages like this and ultimately others contributed to me leaving Christianity. And to be clear, it didn't lead me to believe there's no God. I'm still open to that concept. I consider myself a non-resistant non-believer. But it did lead me to believe that if this is what the Christian God is like, I couldn't follow him. Christians would reject this immediately in any other religion. If another faith kept switching between literal, metaphorical, historical, and symbolic whenever the text got difficult, Christians would see the problem right away for years. I believed the Bible had no contradictions. I preached it that way for 20 years. I also believed I was reading it honestly. But the more I studied and the more I realized what I was really doing, I just kept changing the rules as it fit me. Genesis says God created the world in 6 days. For some Christians, that's literal history. But once science makes that difficult, suddenly it becomes poetry or metaphor. Adam and Eve are treated like real, actual people when Christians need original sin to be a real thing. But when evolution makes a one couple start impossible, suddenly parts of the story become necessarily symbolic. Hell's preached like a real place of conscious torment when people need to be warned about going to hell, but when someone asks how eternal torture for finite sin reflects perfect justice, suddenly hell becomes more mysterious and more nuanced and more metaphorical. God commanding Israel to wipe out an entire people group sounds literal when Christians talk about judgment or judgment of God. But when someone asks how a loving God commands the killing of children, suddenly the same story becomes ancient war rhetoric or hyperbole. Look, I understand why Christians do this. I did it. I preached this way for 20 years, but eventually I had to admit something to myself. I didn't have a consistent way of reading the Bible, nor do any Christians. I had a way of protecting the Bible. When the text supported my theology, I called it literal. When the text created a moral or historical or scientific problem, which there are many, I reached for metaphor or context or genre, or it was just a mystery. Now, that can preserve the faith, but it doesn't prove the Bible's a clear, consistent, or divinely inspired book. In fact, it shows the opposite. It proves how much explaining we actually have to do to keep it from falling apart. If God is real and I ever stand before him, these are some of the questions that I'd have. Why create a world with this much unnecessary suffering? I'm not talking about the suffering that we cause each other as humans. I'm talking about the suffering that just happens completely on its own without our involvement. Why do children get cancer? Why do millions of parents pray every day for those children to be healed and absolutely nothing happens? Why create parasites like the river blindness parasite that seems to exist for the single purpose of burrowing into child's eyes and blinding them? That's its purpose. Why allow earthquakes and floods and fires to wipe out entire families, entire communities in the blink of an eye? Why design a world where animals spend their lives in fear, tearing each other apart just to survive? Why do some people wake up every day in pain for year after year after year with no end in sight? What greater good could possibly require this much pain? What could ever justify it? And if you're perfectly good, why does so much of this world appear to serve no good at all? And if you knew every moment of suffering this world would hold, why create it this way in the first place? Aren't you all powerful? Couldn't you have done literally anything different? One of the reasons I no longer believe in the God of the Bible is something I wrestled with for a very, very long time. It has to do with the contradictions I found in the Bible. And before I go any further, I understand that contradictions really only trouble people who were actually taught that the Bible's infallible or inerrant, that it's exactly what God intended without error in every single detail. Not all Christians believe that, and I understand that. Many see the Bible as sacred or inspired or just meaningful to them, but they also understand it's written by human beings, it's shaped by culture and perspective. And if that's you, contradictions may not feel like a deal breaker at all. But for me, man, they mattered deeply. Because I was taught that my trust in God depended on this book being perfectly reliable in every way. So the question I couldn't escape over time was really this: how many false statements or contradictions can exist before a book isn't trustworthy any longer, the way I was taught to trust it? And once I started looking closely, I just couldn't stop seeing them. I'm going to give you several examples. In one account in the Old Testament, God incites David to take a census, and then there's another account of the same story where Satan incites David to take the census. It's the same event, different cause, can't both be true. In that same story, one version says there would be a punishment of 7 years of famine, and the other story says it would only be 3 years. Both can't be correct. Genesis gives us two accounts of creation. In Genesis 1, humans are created last, after plants and animals. In Genesis 2, humans are created first, before plants and animals. Same book, different order, can't both be true. When you get to the resurrection, the differences really multiply, and this was very challenging for me. The Gospels don't even agree on who went to see Jesus' tomb. They don't agree on how many people were there. They don't agree on what they saw when they got there. One Gospel says an angel appeared. Another says a young man was there. Another says 2 men were there. Another says 2 angels. Luke says Mary and Joseph lived in Nazareth, traveled to Bethlehem for a census where Jesus was born, and then they returned home. But Matthew tells a totally different story. Jesus is born in Bethlehem, wise men visit, the family flees to Egypt, and only later, then they settle in Nazareth. Even the details of Jesus' death don't line up. Mark places Jesus' death after Passover. John places the death before Passover. Those both can't be true. Matthew says Jesus rode into Jerusalem on both a donkey and a colt. Don't know how that happened, but it's what it says. The other Gospels describe just one animal. Matthew and Mark say both criminals that were crucified with Jesus mocked him, but Luke says one of them actually defended Jesus and actually said to be remembered when Jesus came into his kingdom. Even Jesus' final words differ. In one Gospel, my God, why have you forsaken me? In another Gospel, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And another one simply says, it is finished. And then you've got Judas' death. I'm sure you've heard this. Matthew says Judas hanged himself and the priests bought a field. But Acts says Judas fell to his death and that he bought the field. I could go on, and these aren't small copy errors. They're different versions of the same events. And I tried to harmonize them. I really did, like for years. And you can always explain away maybe 1 or 2 or, 5, but eventually I had to ask myself, if this book is perfectly true in every detail, if it's inerrant, infallible, why does it require so much explaining to make it appear that way? For me, that question didn't lead to anger. It really led to grief. And then slowly it kind of led to honesty, just being honest about where my trust broke in the Word and why I no longer believe in the God that I was taught that the Bible revealed. Look, I know others think differently about this. Some of you are able to harmonize all this in your own mind, but I just couldn't. I couldn't unsee these contradictions. And it was a perfect God giving me a perfect Word. It wouldn't have these contradictions. If you thought about this differently or you've wrestled with it yourself, I'd really like to know what you think about it.